in my brain, I'm also thinking this discussion about Karl Marx, if this was like 20 years ago, it would be very different, because a lot, maybe this is to Annie's point, a lot has happened globally. Different kinds of social movements have emerged that complicate, that has complicated this discussion on Karl Marx. So, and the reason we're doing it, it's his birthday tomorrow. He was born on the 5th of May, 1818. So one of the comments that people, so on the YouTube channel, there are people have been making lots of comments. And maybe the next question regards Karl Marx and trying to understand African politics, or the African political economy. And people are there making comments that, people like Walter Rodney, Claude Ake from Nigeria, Sula Marx from South Africa, Bernd Freund, that many of these people, you can see them as part of a Marxist tradition coming out of Africa. My question is, why? Well, let me say to you. Well, the question we had is like, why is Marx and Marxism in decline in Africa? I mean, that, well, first we'd have to, I suppose, agree that it's in decline. I mean, I have the sense that it's in decline. And then I think the follow-up is then, why is that the case?
Actually, so you go first.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's a difficult question. I think it would depend, regionally where we're looking, of course. But I take your general point. I mean, I think one interesting phenomena since sort of maybe like the 1990s is to see sort of the role that what we can call sort of the transformation of African politics into a kind of NGO, dominated project. Because what has happened is that you've had all those experienced organizers who were either in Marxist organizations or Marxist influenced organizations, and they've sort of been co-opted, I think, in this NGO structure. I think, like, for example, in Egypt, that's definitely the case. Maybe in South Africa, it's similar. So I think even sort of the kind of organizational experience that would allow people to develop an organization that would intervene at a kind of opportune moments, because we've had opportune moments in different countries. I think that sort of hasn't been there. And I think there is also, and this is hinted at, I believe, in the write-up for this episode, the kind of transformation, again, of emancipatory politics into a kind of cultural discourse taking place in the realm of representation, which, not to say that this is not important, but I think there are very clear limits to that. Yeah, but it's a good question, and I don't really, pretend to have a well-developed answer.
Jump in. If you have the answer.
I would make the slightly bold claim that I think that mass Marxist organization is on the decline globally, right? And I remember Robin Kelly reminded us, when the Russian Revolution happened, there were waves of strikes which included 70% of the population. That is a critical mass, right? And so I think two things contribute to this. One is an erasure and assault on a revolutionary imaginary as it was able to institutionalize itself in the kind of mid to late 1970s, the decline in neoliberalization and marketization of African universities, the reorientation of curriculums, and to get some of these texts that we're talking about in terms of African political economists, Marxist, African Marxist tradition, you're looking at 60, 70 pounds for a copy because they're just out of print, right? And so in a very tangible sense, the texts which are able to speak to the specific context of African countries are becoming more and more out of reach. I think the second dynamic of that, and I think Zeyad's completely right about the rise of a culturalist frame of understanding politics. I think that in different ways in the imperial core and in the global periphery, in loads of parts of the world, what we've seen is a recession of the political. And things are increasingly understood in cultural terms and essentialist terms. I am trying to interrogate in my work the relationship between that and the rise of the relationship between the rise of like that form of essentialist culturalist politics embedded in not just representational politics, but also embedded in some of the strands of identity politics, which seem to be taking root. I'm going to risk myself getting cancelled on the internet and talk about, you know, the developments in the kind of fullness movements in South Africa, where you see like radical political imaginaries be increasingly inhibited by essentialist understandings of race, of culture, and of political struggle, essentially, right? And so I do think that maybe the question is more so, what is it about the conditions of this moment which mean that the Marxist theory that we're drawing on doesn't have the degree of appeal that it historically has had? And what does that mean for how we reorient our tools of analysis and what we need to be speaking to?
So,
sorry, it's interesting you say that. I know Will has a question, but I read this earlier today in the introduction to On the Post-Colony by Achille Mbembe, who's also very much associated with this kind of, you know, this. Well, I mean, maybe we should debate him another time. But your comment about the move to sort of the cultural, political cultural explanations, political identity, he actually writes in the introduction of the book that, quote, helped by the collapse of Marxism as an analytical tool, all-embracing project, and by the demise of theories of dependency, economic explanations of contemporary social and political phenomena have, with consideration of the draconian character of external constraints, all but disappeared. All struggles have become struggles of representation. Levies, exploitation, corvée, taxes, tribute, and coercion no longer exist. Everything has become networked, and no one asks anymore about the market and capitalism as institutions both contingent and violent. I thought it was interesting that even Achille Mbembe in the introduction to his book, which is very much kind of associated with a sort of critique of Marxism, view on school, acknowledges that in the introduction.
Yeah, and I think this relates to the question I want to ask, which is, you know, Annie, you were saying that you're trying to think through these essentialist understandings of social categories that are starting to become embedded in identity politics and in sort of progressive politics. And, you know, I'm starting to notice it sometimes, occasionally, on the radical left as well. So, you know, I might get canceled for saying this, but sometimes I often get a little bit uncomfortable, you know, reading Cedric Robinson's work. And we did a show about him very recently, which was extremely illuminating. But I suppose what I struggle to grapple with is how Robinson, you know, presents the Black radical tradition in opposition to Marxism, and, you know, presents the Black radical tradition almost as an alternative to Marxist politics, and refers to a group of intellectuals that I would ordinarily associate with Marxism. So I suppose the question I want to ask is, what do you think produces this kind of interest in trying to present a radical politics, but one that is detached from Marx? So I guess really it's just a question of Cedric Robinson and how you receive him in relation to the conversation that we've been having. But how do we make sense of this sort of development?
Yeah, one of the people that I want to kind of focus on eventually in my project. So I'm going to reserve some comment, some of the comments. I would say that I am increasingly thinking of 1983 as a transition year. That's the year that Black Marxism came out. And it's also incidentally the year that the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies released a book called Empire Strikes Back. And these are strikingly oppositional accounts of what trends are developing and also how we ought to conceive of our political communities. And I read Robinson and ask two questions. Firstly, in terms of the stakes of proving a racialism that exists in Europe prior to capitalism and prior to colonization, if, for instance, that requires us hollowing out the concept of racialism to such an extent that it's just as easily applicable to the cultural differences that exist on the continent prior to colonization. In that sense, racialism isn't a unique export of Europe to the rest of the world. The second problem I have is a reading of, and this is oftentimes things that people ascribe to Robinson after the text. I mean, a lot of people kind of go to Black Marxism thinking it's going to be some kind of Bible of Black Marxism. But so many of the people who are ascribed as part of the Black radical tradition in opposition to Marxism derive their radical politics and develop their radical politics through dialogue with and organization with radical movements which aren't categorized as Black within this framework, right? And so what does it mean to extricate this particular dynamic of racialization as Black as being the sole determining factor? Now, I don't think Robinson is making the argument as crudely as that, but I would kind of suggest that if we're to kind of, I don't know, I think for me, the more helpful framing is theorizing Black as a subject position. And that subject position doesn't have to map onto a material reality. I think most of the problems we have come from theorizing this position of the Black in the abstract and then trying to map that really neatly onto, when we know that it's sort of produced by all of these different processes, map that then onto the category of the sub-Saharan African or the person of sub-Saharan African descent, and that's really messy. Sorry, I hope that made sense. I kind of went around a bit in rambling.
Yeah, I mean, if I can say, yeah, something also on Black Marxism. I mean, I think maybe it has something to do more with the reception of the text than maybe Robinson's intention, but maybe it's sort of, lended itself to that reading. But I think one criticism that we can make also of Robinson is that, when you read the text, one thing I found surprising is the extent to which the concept of Western civilization plays an important analytic role, right? Because part of the argument is that Marxism emerged from this civilization, and he doesn't really, define for us what Western civilization means, but I would say that precisely where a kind of historical materialist analysis would fit in is to sort of question the analytic adequacy of a concept like Western civilization or Western culture or something like that, because it always forces you, obviously, you do have, the kind of relative autonomy of cultural spheres and all of that, but you still have to tie to specific modes of production, and that allows you to also note discontinuities, because this idea of Western civilization, it's also a kind of very 19th century development. It's a created image, positing discontinuity. I mean, somebody like Aristotle wouldn't think of himself as Western, if he was alive, but yet he gets assimilated into that discourse, of course.
Yeah, that's such an interesting thread to continue on from both of you. When we think of how, Western civilization can end up being reified as a continuous category that is fixed and doesn't change as social reality changes, how do we sort of position the relationship between Marxism and sort of the rise of, post-colonial studies? We were talking about Zeyad earlier, and Zeyad is often attributed as being the founder of this, and he himself denied that. So this mode of critique that sort of, whose object is practically Western civilization and how the world is constructed in its image. So, I mean, there's this always uneasy relationship between the two bodies of thought, and can the differences between the two of them be reconciled, or are they irreconcilable? I think these debates, especially nowadays, feel like they're reaching a fever pitch.
You can go first.
trying to get both of you cancelled after this by asking you.
Yeah, we're sorry. We're sorry.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
I don't want to say anything. I don't want to say anything glib. I would say I remember watching years and years ago, and I can't remember who it is, but it was a post-colonial theorist, and they were speaking in the introduction to a talk about this letter that Engels wrote to the editor of a newspaper on the relative kind of the question of the role of politics versus the role of like the economic question. And it was really interesting because what that opened up for me is like a rethinking. I think part of what the academy does today is like reify the strict opposition between categories of thinking, right? And if we step back and say, okay, well, like what are the tools that are being offered by this frame of thinking? What are the tools that are being offered by Marxism? What are the tools that are being offered by postcolonial theory? Sometimes they are in opposition. What we can then see is the really interesting ways in which people are engaging with each other. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. But all of that is to say that I have my own feelings about how like the notion of the post-colonial reorients our thinking to believing that we live in a post-colonial world, which we obviously don't. We face active settler colonial projects, not least in Palestine, but also just kind of thinking about what role that played. And actually, I can't remember the text, but it's a David Scott text, which talks about how the moment of the post-colonial is also the moment of the notion of a global revolution being receded into the notion of the nation, and the nation building project suddenly taking primacy over the project of global transformation. And I think that really speaks well to how a lot of movements on the African continent in the mid to late 20th century get read today as nationalist movements, which sought to build particular types of state. And then the primary question becomes how that state is able to leverage power vis-a-vis the West, rather than the question of how the people who were engaged in that project on a mass scale were seeking to bring about a world in which, well, the nation state form itself became irrelevant, and the community or the associations of people became more important.